Today, I want to explore a book called The Brothers Karamazov. It's actually regarded as one of the best novels ever written. After reading it, I can attest to that. It does have so much depth, so many lessons to draw from, and it's just insane how unique the characters are. It's almost like the book has a life of its own. The book is written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. He is a pseudo-philosopher, novel writer. He's from Russia, so the version that you get is obviously going to be translated. This book is from the 1800s, I believe. It matters which translation you get, some are better than others, but I highly recommend it, and you don't even have to have read the book to listen to my discussion here. The lessons are universal, and I won't spoil it. So, without further ado, I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The Brothers Karamazov centers around three brothers, but I'd wager that there really are five main characters here that you should know about. First of all, there's a father. He's called Fyodor, named after the author. How would you describe this character? He is somebody who is very hedonistic, essentially only concerned with the pleasures of life. He doesn't care about his three children. Actually, it's complicated, but there's really four. He doesn't care about his children at all. To him, life is simply about chasing pleasure in the form of money, or women, or simply just fooling around. He's known as the village idiot because of all the nonsense that he brings about. And I should also mention too, before we go too far, that these five main characters all represent a certain type of ideology or way of living. They aren't realistic per se, but they are dramatic embodiments of what the ideologies truly represent. This character is full on hedonism, not considering what life really is, simply being distracted by debauchery. That's what Fyodor, the father, represents. Now we move on to the first child. His name is Dmitri, and he shares a lot of similar traits with the father. Very caught up in hedonism, debauchery, but at the same time, he is very passionate though. The father moves away from true interest. He's better off just getting drunk and pursuing money and frivolous relationships, but Dmitri is different. He loves people. He goes after a certain woman, and he will do anything in his power to get her. He kind of is a mix of the hopeless romantic type of worldview versus the fool. Now, you move on to some of the more interesting characters. The second child, that's Ivan. He represents the atheist, somebody who has disregarded all hope in things like a higher power, faith, and whatnot. To him, it's all irrelevant, and the main argument that he poses throughout the entire novel is the battle between good and evil. His central claim is that simply because evil exists, how could a all-knowing God allow that to happen? It seems irrational. And even if there is a God, if he created a world where children are experiencing great levels of torture and horror and are being killed simply so he can have a seat in heaven, he wants no part in that. Ivan represents a form of New Age thinking, a complete disconnect between the prior held spiritual beliefs of generations from before and a new way of seeing the world as simply just you living. There really isn't anything much beyond that. Now, in contrast to Ivan, there is an illegitimate child. Fyodor supposedly impregnated some random woman, and this half-son ended up becoming a servant of Fyodor, so he wasn't treated with the same level of respect as a true-born heir. Fyodor was quite rich, he had property. So, this child's name is Smerdyakov, and he is jaded with life. He actually looks at Ivan as a role model. He sees the conditions of his worldview, living in poverty, not having the resources to climb, and he says things are just not fair. Smerdyakov ends up embodying nihilism, and that's one level beyond Ivan. He doesn't think anything is actually worth it in life. Life actually just sucks for everyone. There is no meaning here, and there isn't any rules either. Smerdyakov is the closest thing to evil that we get in this novel, and he is motivated by a worldview that's based on this fact, or a supposed fact, that since nothing matters in this world, everything is permissible. So Smerdyakov goes around causing mischief, killing animals, and plotting, trying to screw people over. Then we move on to the fifth character, who is Alyosha. He is a monk, probably the hero of the book, the best character. Maybe Fyodor, the author, was putting forward his bias here, but Alyosha is that person who does believe in things like faith, living a good life, living virtue, and it's funny too because Ivan and him have encounters in the novel where they debate the existence of God and religion. Ivan always beats Alyosha. Alyosha can't debate him. He's not on that intellectual level, but Alyosha doesn't seem to be shaken though. There's something about his undying faith that's a caricature of a monk. Now, the book revolves around these characters, and it's not really about the plot, so it's about a dysfunctional family, but that comes secondary to the actual context, the quotes and the narrative between them. Every paragraph is essentially a debate, trying to expose you to some realities and facts about life, and I want to focus on those today. The first quote that I want to share is this: above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth from within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. Now, to put into context, that is a individual who's giving advice to Fyodor, the father, in the novel. Somebody who actually doesn't love anything. He respects nothing, and why is that? The quote posits that you start going down this train once you enable yourself to believe your own lies. That's quite powerful, because one of the side effects is losing the ability to love, losing the ability to figure out what's true and what's not. One of the hardest things to do in life is really to self-reflect. Fyodor is a terrible person. By all measures, he didn't care about his children. He lives a life of foolishness, constantly gets drunk, and I don't want to spoil the plot because I think you should read it, but the things he does to some of the characters in the novel are just bewildering. But somehow, Fyodor doesn't seem to realize that. The obvious facts of the matter are clear, but he's constantly lying to himself, trying to convince himself that he is the victim of the situation, not the perpetrator. And what does that do to him? It creates a disconnect where he's not actually seeing the real Fyodor. He's seeing an image that he's conjured up for himself. Now, it's gone to the point where he actually believes it. He is convinced by repeatedly telling himself something. He has become a slave to his cognition. Now, he actually can't tell what's true or what's not. When people come to him and they tell him something like, Fyodor, you really need to tone it down, he is bewildered. He's actually offended by that because he can't come to grips with reality. He has fed himself a narrative for far too long, and now he has become an ideologue. When you lie to yourself, you become trapped. You become ensnared by whatever it is that you're telling you. You're not flexible anymore. The truth really is what sets you free because you're able to adapt to whatever the truth is. That might change over time, but a lie, that is rigid. It's whatever you've created, and you're going to try and hold true to whatever that is. And that's heavily applicable to today's world. I see it time and time again. People are constantly not agreeing with the truth, with the reality of matters, political or not, because they have lied to themselves for far too long. They have bought into an ideology, and they become a caricature of it. They become an ideologue. I think this part at the end really is very applicable in today's age of polarization. The person who falls into that trap ceases to love. We can see that. People are so entrenched in their own visions of whatever reality is to them that they cannot relate to the other side. The goal that brings all of humanity together is truth. It is something that is objective, something we can all strive towards, but when all of us have these subjective worldviews and we are bogged down by them, we stop caring about that, the common ground. We're simply focused on what it is that we've conjured for ourselves. That's a terrible mistake, and it all starts with you lying to yourself. Holding truth in the highest regard is one way for us to avoid these pitfalls here and not becoming like a Fyodor. I think that was quite powerful. It's expressing to you how vital it is to just be truthful, to pursue the truth, and to avoid the temptation of buying into your own nonsense, basically. So now we move on to the second quote that I found quite interesting. It was, I love mankind, but I find to my amazement that the more I love mankind as a whole, the less I love men in particular. Maybe you can relate to this feeling. To me, this comes across as you really are amazed by the potential of humans, the things that we've been able to do, and seemingly what we can still do. There really is no limit to that. Potential is here, and it's infinite. But that's only for humanity as a whole. When you look at the individuals that compromise the entity, you see people like Fyodor, maybe, people who are caught up in madness, people who are doing things contrary to advancement, and you might think to yourself, wow, that's actually a major sin, to be detracting from human potential. Mankind is so powerful. To know that we have virtually no limits on what we can do is crazy. In only a couple hundred years, we've advanced humanity from point A to point Z at a rapid rate. And we have people here who are not buying into that vision, people who are detracting from it. We love mankind, but on the individual level, there are certain people who are just terrible. And it may not even be you being terrible, it could be you being complacent or not living up to a certain standard. This is the worldview of somebody who is demanding a lot, who sees our potential and wants to maximize it, and any type of reduction from that is seen as a detriment. It's almost paradoxical because mankind encompasses every group of human, of individual. But when we break it down, some of the individuals we find to be so distasteful that it bothers us that we actually don't love them at all. But then we'll say we love mankind. How can you hold those two worldviews at the same time? To me, this is indicating something that we have to get past, this idea of tribalism, of breaking things down into their subset categories. It really is just humanity that spans across all humans, and if we don't start looking at the world like that, we are setting ourselves up for failure. There is probably another side effect to this as well, which is partisanship. The people that you do like that are visible within this mankind unit are the ones that you're going to be acting for. The ones you don't like, well, you might not be in favor of anything that benefits them. This is how you get back to tribalism, and to me, it's something that should be avoided at all costs. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is something that I found to be very inspiring, and it says the mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. This goes back to the idea of purpose. You simply staying alive is quite the horrid existence, I must say. If all you're doing is eating food and just maintaining yourself so you can get to the next day, that's an empty type of way to go about your existence. But the key really is to find out what you want to live for. That's going to be different for everybody. That's why when people say what's the meaning of life, there really isn't a correct answer to that. It depends on the person, the interpreter. This may be you living for your family, for your children, for your spouse, for the world. You might be trying to create something impactful that's going to help communities. You might be trying to do something that's going to help your neighborhood. You might be trying to raise the best child possible, the best pet, trying to advance your career. Some of these are obviously more noble than others, but the same thread runs through all of them. They are things to live for, something to get you out of bed in the morning when you don't want to. Simple survival isn't that. And this runs contrary to the idea of nihilism, trying to tell you that life is meaningless. It's not true. You actually don't even need religion to come to this conclusion. There are many things in this world materially that are worth trying for, that are worth putting an effort to attain or to improve. And here's something else that pairs with this quote quite well. Somebody who has a why can figure out the how. If you have a why for living, you're going to find out the how. If your why is to provide for your kid, why do you work? You're going to figure it out. Why do you do what you do? If you can't answer that question, you need to figure it out. You need to dig deeper and truly establish the motivation behind your actions. Once you understand that, you're going to be able to put forth a lot more enthusiasm in your daily endeavors because you truly understand the purpose behind it, what you're striving towards. And if you ever do reach your goal, you find a new one. That's life, it's progression. To not have one and to simply rely on just getting by through survivalism, that's not enough, and it's not going to feed your soul. Every character in this book actually had a reason for living, except for one. One character did not have any reason for living at all. I'm not going to spoil it, but what they ended up doing was they killed themselves because it was so depressing to not have a goal. I'm not saying that anyone without a goal is going to do that, but that's one path that's laid out for you. If you truly understand your why, if you can find something to live for, you will avoid a lot of misfortune, and that pillar will help you move forward through the horrors of living. It's interesting because in the book, there's a wide variety of these reasons. You can find inspiration or relate to any of them, but you need one. Now, the next quote. The world says that you have needs. Satisfy them. You have as much right as the rich and the mighty. Don't hesitate to satisfy your needs. Indeed, expand your needs and demand more. This is the worldly doctrine of today, and they believe that is freedom. The result for the rich is isolation and suicide, for the poor, envy and murder. That's heavily tied to the previous quote. There's a lot there, so let's try to break it down piece by piece. So the world says that you have needs. It's true. Satisfy them. You have as much right as the rich and the mighty. That's true, but what do you define as a need? Is it food, housing, healthcare? I'm on board with that, but it then goes on to say that that's not simply today's worldview. It goes beyond that. Indeed, you have your needs, but expand them and demand more. It really speaks to our society, always wanting more. When are you ever satisfied? The answer is never. It really never comes about because you're going to accumulate whatever it is that you've sought for, and you're going to want more. More and more and more. You're going to continually expand your needs, and you're going to demand. That is the way that we have been living for quite some time now. Accumulation of things like wealth and these material possessions. But what happens when you do that? Is that freedom? It really isn't. That's you being a slave to the system. It's you being a puppet. Effectively, you're acting in a way to acquire more and more of whatever it is that you desire. You are a slave to your desire. You will never be satisfied. That's not freedom. It's a perpetual game of you in a hamster wheel. There is no end to it. Now, what happens with social interaction in a system like that? If you're at the bottom and you see those at the top who are striving and gaining more and more and more, while you yourself want more and more and more, you're going to envy them. You're going to end up, well, they say murder in the quote. That's one of the extremes, and it could get to that. We've seen it in history with uprisings and whatnot. But more likely, you're going to end up hating those above you because you want to be like them. But you reverse it, and how are those on top doing in their constant search for more material possessions and whatnot? Well, they get isolated. They are driven to a form of madness because they're continually striving for something that doesn't really matter. All the money in the world isn't going to do much for you if you are empty and you are hollow. At the same time, there's a concept of diminishing returns here. Once you are earning $100 million, for example, an extra 100,000 means literally nothing to you. It's not going to increase your standard of life by one modicum. But still, we pursue it like it's going to be game-changing. That's not the case, and the quote here says the final outcome is suicide. That might be because you realize you are in that hamster wheel, that you are striving towards something that A, is unattainable because you keep expanding what that is, and 2, it doesn't really matter. It's not a good reason for living. You need to find something to live for that is sustainable, something that is worth it. This is not it. It's one of the fundamental issues that we are plagued with in our society. And by expanding a little bit, you can see where these things lead to. So at the top, once you've gathered all these things, you keep expanding, you are going to get hit with nihilism. That's what this quote is saying to you, because you understand that it doesn't really matter. These things are irrelevant, and you've wasted so much time pursuing a never-ending goal that isn't even steeped with virtue. It's just not something that can power you through life. Then at the bottom, you're going to be drawn to ideas like socialism because you see people at the top and you believe that you deserve as much of that wealth as they have, and we want it. It's unfair. The envy starts to stem, and there's going to be a conflict there. The reality is, though, that we need to create a baseline for people. The inequality only matters to a point where people at the bottom are in destitution. If you cannot provide for yourself, then yes, this thing is going to hurt more given these gaps. But if everyone's okay, then it matters less. And at the same time, once we reach that point, we have to ask ourselves, why do we continually expand the borders as to what is acceptable, as to what our goals are when it comes to monetary and financial posts? There's a lot of work that we have to do as a society, or rather as mankind, to really reach the answer to these questions here. And now I also ask myself this, what is it that I learned from these texts? I feel like I've learned a lot, but I'm having trouble articulating it. The reason is I didn't find this novel to be a thesis of some sort, seeking to confirm a proposition. There wasn't a particular theory per se. It wasn't trying to convince me of the best way of living. Instead, it showed me a plethora of methods, a plethora of unique characters, all with their own stories and their own perspectives. And you'll understand if you give it a shot. The book is a little bit slow at the beginning, but it picks up that there is a certain message that's being given here, and it's made evident through the encounters of the book. I don't want to spoil the contents for you. That's why I've only given quotes here, but it's very powerful. In fact, every character in this book having their own worldview really is just an icon or a stereotype. They aren't realistic per se. Nobody's going to be acting like these people, but it reveals what lies at the core of a singular ideology and illustrates the downfalls of them. If there was one thing I gained from this novel, it's that we all have a certain duty to one another. Even those who may be portrayed as villains, once you dig deep into their tale, it's quite often muddled. Very rarely do you encounter a true spawn of Satan. Worldly circumstances play a large role in most of our development. Everyone is trying to figure things out in their own way, to varying degrees of success. Not every method that people take is equally valid. It's actually quite the contrary. There appears to be a handful of right ways to do things, but there are infinite ways to do things incorrectly, as outlined by characters like Alyosha versus Smerdyakov. The irony here is that it's quite clear to us as spectators. I don't think anyone's going to come forward and say a character like Smerdyakov, who is knee-deep in nihilism, is living his best life. But when you're the individual who is living that experience, when you are in the trenches yourself, your vision can be obscured. It's a lot easier to identify these weaknesses in other people, but when it comes to us, not so much. And that relates back to the first quote about not lying to yourself. The fact is, if you are walking a path of virtue, integrity, and you feel like you know some type of answer or some right way of doing things, it's your duty to share that with mankind, even if you don't like certain men or women in that equation. Everyone has the same goal fundamentally, which is traversing the horrors of life, trying to advance humanity. If you love mankind, that's the least you can do, even if you don't like certain men in particular. Now I will close with this, and it's a rant against intersectionality. People will tell you that you can't relate to somebody because you don't have their lived experience, and here is the quote I will use to refute that. I am a man, therefore I understand everything human. You don't have to have gone through the exact same scenarios as somebody to understand the way in which that has affected them. Going through this book, I have not experienced nihilism to the degree as Smerdyakov, but the way it was portrayed and explained, we have a tool in our arsenal called empathy and compassion and understanding and human ideological projection that allows us to grasp those emotions, to understand the context. I've never been in the army, but I understand how that may have played a role in affecting Dimitri's progression. Alyosha is a monk. I've never been a monk either, but I understand these things here. The whole idea of intersectionality is nonsense, and it actually creates more barriers between people, between understanding. It brings us further away from the goal of reaching mankind. The same can be true for things like moral relativism. These are just nonsensical ideas, and I hope we dispense with them as soon as possible. They are contrary to everything that stands before us, and it limits our potential more and more each day that we buy into them. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram @PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.